Welcome to the Actionable Futurist podcast, a show all about the near-term future with practical and actionable advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and actionable futurist Andrew Grill.
Today's guest is Suzy Alegre, an international lawyer, author and speaker who has worked on some of the most challenging legal and political issues of our time, including human rights and security, combating corruption in the developing world, protecting human rights at borders, the human rights impact of climate change on small island states, privacy, cybersecurity, disinformation, data protection, and neurotech. Her experience includes both judicial and oversight roles in the UK and internationally. Suzy has particular expertise around tech ethics and neuroscience through the lens of human rights, bringing both legal skills and a background in philosophy to the key ethical questions of our time. She is also a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And importantly, she just released a book, Freedom to Think, The Long Struggle to Liberate Our Minds. Welcome, Suzy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, we've spoken a few times ahead of this podcast, and every time it's been really enjoyable and I've learnt so much. And the book is just an amazing read. I know it's got some great accolades, and I encourage people to go out and buy it and read it. I'll put some links on the show notes. Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom." So how relevant is this quote in 2022?
I think it's a really key point, actually, that one of the big issues about our online information environment is that it's undermining our ability to filter information, to find the information we need, to have enough quiet time to actually sit down and consider deeply the huge challenges that we're all facing, both as individuals and as communities. And really, it is about this idea of freedom of thought, that we need freedom of thought. We need the peace inside our heads to be able to actually concentrate on and think seriously about the things that really, really matter and the things that will matter for our future. And I suppose that is what you might call wisdom, if you like, this ability to think deeply and broadly about the challenges that we face as humans.
If you think about years ago when we didn't have mobile phones at our fingertips all the time, we would have time to think. In fact, a friend of mine at IBM, he wrote into his contract that every Friday he would have the day off to think. And I thought, that's a luxury, but actually, maybe we should be doing that. We should actually carve out time to say, I'm not available. I want to sit down, review what I've done this week, review what I'm doing next week. Otherwise, how do we innovate if we're not able to think? And your book and your whole body of work talks about is that there are so many interruptions, both good and bad, that are stopping us being able to think. I'm glad we met through our mutual friend Greg Dowling from Cadastra. I've been looking at the technical aspects of new technology over the last 4 seasons on this podcast, and I've not paid much attention to the human aspects, and that's where your book and insights come in. So what inspired you to write the book?
Well, my original inspiration came from reading about behavioural microtargeting in political campaigns in early 2017. I think it was probably the first article about what became the Cambridge Analytica scandal about a year later. And when I first read about it, it was kind of the thing of, political drama that you might watch on Netflix. It was a sort of House of Cards idea, this, gathering huge amounts of data in order to manipulate the electorate on an individual level. And here it was, actually being sold as a service in the UK, in the US, around the world. And when I first read about it, it was a real dawning realization that is why data protection matters. It's not about privacy. It's not about who knows my name. It's about people understanding how I think and using that information to manipulate and change how I think in order to change my behavior. And when you put that in the voting and sort of democratic elections context, it undermines the whole premise of democracy, this idea of one person, one vote, that we all are able to sit around and take account of the messages that are being given by different politicians, the promises they're making us, and make an informed decision about the direction we want our society to go in. If essentially we are all just puppets being manipulated through social media, then that premise doesn't work at all. And I suppose on a really fundamental personal level, when I was reading about it and I was thinking about my own experience and sort of in the run up to the Brexit referendum, and, I'd spent most of my career being very much a European lawyer. I trained in the European Commission. My last international posting was working for the European Union in Uganda. I worked a lot advising the European Parliament. I was a European law specialist. So Brexit was quite an existential issue for me. And yet I didn't go out and campaign against Brexit. I mean, you wouldn't need complex data analytics to look at my background and guess which way I might vote. But I didn't campaign. I didn't go out and shout from the rooftops about how dangerous it was. And one of the reasons why I didn't do that was because I didn't really believe it would happen. I sat in rooms of people like me, speaking different languages in Europe, talking about it as a sort of hypothetical nightmare that would never actually happen. It was a sort of intellectual exercise. And so when I read about behavioral microtargeting, it crossed my mind that perhaps the reason I hadn't taken action and campaigned was precisely because my social media feeds were telling me it was fine, that I didn't need to worry about it, that I could just stay home and watch cat videos or House of Cards on Netflix. And that really disturbed me. Whether or not it actually happened doesn't matter. The idea that that was the premise of this service that was being sold, that it would encourage the right people to get to the voting booth and the wrong people to not worry too much about it and stay at home in a way that could shift the result of elections or referenda that are going to affect the course of our lives and have done over the last 5 years was really, really disturbing. And it felt deeply personal, this idea that my mind could have been hacked. And when you listen to people talking about Cambridge Analytica, there was a sort of assumption that, I'm not stupid enough to fall for that. It's sort of precisely the people who think they're not stupid enough who are probably the best candidates for this kind of targeting. And whether or not it worked, as I say, the idea that this would be lawfully sold as a service in a democratic country, I found deeply disturbing. And that's what set me down this path of looking at, what actually does the right to freedom of opinion mean? What does the right to freedom of thought mean? How is the inside of my head protected in international human rights law? And I found that it was an area that had been very under-researched. There was almost nothing written about it, a little bit in relation to neurotech and criminal justice, but otherwise almost nothing. And yet the trend of technological development in all areas, whether it's political, whether it's health tech, whether it's educational tech, when I started to look at it, the trend is precisely to try and get inside our heads and move around the furniture and affect the way we think and behave. That's kind of the point of it. And that then, to me, raised a really big question of, is this what we want from the future of technology?
I've had a lot of guests on the podcast that have spoken about the power of data, and there's data for good, and I think we've seen some examples here of data for bad. And we've always wanted to have that one-to-one relationship where marketers or advertisers can say, I know exactly how Susie's thinking, voting. I still read things in my Facebook feed about people that are having a conversation at a dinner table and then an ad for that particular service pops up and they wonder whether their phones are listening to them. But that's a whole other discussion. One thing that made me realise that I would love talking to you was you reread a couple of my favourite books during lockdown, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And people often ask me, when did I become a futurist? And back in 1985, when I was doing my leaving English exam and studied those books, that's what I read. And I'm wondering whether in rereading those, you're then seeing some echoes of what happened around the Cambridge Analytica. What are the parallels that you saw in rereading those books with what's actually happened today?
One of the things that I found astonishing, particularly with 1984, but with both those books really in different ways, was how prescient they were. And it was almost as if instead of taking them as a warning in the 20th century and going in an opposite direction to prevent this happening, we took it as a template and thought, wow, look at all these great ideas. We have the ubiquitous telescreen that Orwell spoke about, where you couldn't actually get away from this all-seeing eyes of Big Brother, that you couldn't switch it off. It's not just the telescreen on the walls in our homes, it's the telescreen in our pockets that we're voluntarily carrying around with us and sharing, to the cloud or to TikTok or whatever it is. We're all doing this all the time. Another thing that I'd forgotten in 1984 was the speak right machine. And again, it's this idea that all history, all narrative had to be put through this machine so that it could be controlled and altered to fit the party narrative. And this idea of the massaging and curation of information is what we're seeing now in the online world. It's the ability en masse to curate information. One of the things that was really striking for me about 1984 was that we start off with Winston Smith and the ultimate thought crime, which was to buy a notebook and a pen and to sit outside the view of the telescreen and of Big Brother and to start to write. And that essentially it didn't matter what he wrote. It was just the fact of writing away from the surveillance, which was in itself a thought crime. Quite a lot of the book was written by hand with a fountain pen in a notebook as I was working on it, in a way, because for me, writing by hand, and particularly, like I say, if I'm using a fountain pen as opposed to just using a pencil, it accesses different parts of my brain. The way I think, the way I express myself is very different handwritten to what it is if I'm typing, particularly if I'm texting. So, the whole way we communicate and the way we think, I think, is affected by the mediums that we use. So for Orwell, these big things, the changing of history, the managing of history through our information flows, were all really interesting echoes of what we're seeing today. And for Huxley, the idea of controlling what people are, deciding what people are, the kind of the eugenics movement, this idea of people being put in boxes that will define their future and of sort of knowing your place in society, is something which, going back to this idea of us being sort of categorized by our data, that then affects what job adverts we're going to get, what college adverts we're going to get, what people are going to think about people like us, what we're going to think about ourselves and our future prospects. And that, combined with the dumbing down of the intellectual environment for distraction that we see in Brave New World, this idea that actually, if we just distract everyone, they'll be happy and they won't worry about the underlying problems. The hypersexualization that you see in Brave New World was something that, again, I'd forgotten over the decades. But what we see with Huxley is that, even children are being hypersexualized in order to remove the emotional weight of human sexual activity, if you like. It's something that is essentially removing our humanity. And that's something that we certainly see in the online world, the preponderance of online pornography, but also just generally this sort of hypersexualization in the consumer world. And so both of those books resonated really strongly and in ways that were so disturbing that you thought, God, has nobody read this? Or have they read it? And were they taking notes? And is this why we're going in this direction? I don't know how you felt about those two books as well in terms of the resonance today.
Now that technology has caught up, that we can do these things at scale, there's cloud technology, we've got quantum computing, so there's even another hyper level of personalization we might see. Just going back to the Cambridge Analytica, because I think what that did is it put on the front page of the paper, Facebook did what with my data? And the average person in the street was made aware, whether they understand what it means or not. Big tech, let's call them, the FANG group, they are doing things with our data that maybe we hadn't designed. And we'll talk about Sir Tim Berners-Lee in a minute, because he also has a view of where his World Wide Web invention's gone. What I love about you is you're not just a historian, you're an active legal practitioner. You actually preside over cases and the complex ones. So let's bring in the regulation here. Consumers are now saying we need to be careful that things are happening with our data we're not aware of. But other regulators now going, my goodness, we wish we'd read 1984 as well, because the whole Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal has brought up a whole issues around regulation and what happens with data. And when we talked in a previous call, you were talking about surveillance advertising. And you went as far as saying is that it will be banned in 5 or 10 years. So let's unpack that. Regulation, surveillance advertising, where will we be in 10 years' time?
On regulation, everyone is scrambling because everybody recognizes we have a problem. It's, so, okay, there's a big problem. What are we going to do about it? The online environment is affecting our societies very deeply. In some places we see, in places like Myanmar or Ethiopia, we're looking at genocide being driven and contributed to by management of that online space, particularly through Facebook. These are things that as well are not limited to other countries. They are things that we can see in the online space at home. We can see the rise of the incel movement and misogyny in Britain is coming in many ways through this sort of information environment. And so you can see regulators really struggling to work out what can we do. There's been a lot of stress on things like online content moderation, but content moderation doesn't really get to the heart of the problem. Because pieces of content on their own may not actually be problematic. They may not come to what you might call a level of illegal speech. And illegal speech, the illegality of speech depends on the context. It depends on the intention, and it depends on the place that it's being used and what it's being used for. You can't just pick a sentence and say this is obviously an illegal sentence. So we see content moderation is somehow playing whack-a-mole and sort of trying to deal with a problem at the wrong end of the problem. The problem itself is coming from the flows of information, the way algorithms are spreading information. It's the way we're receiving information. As I said earlier about how your brain reacts differently if you're handwriting to if you're texting or typing, the same goes for reading. There's been quite a lot of research that our brains take in information that we're looking at off a screen differently to the way our brains take in information off a paper. So if you think about the sort of the curation, but also the medium of the way information is being delivered, that is where we need to be looking at the question of regulation. And one of the big drivers of the way information is being spread around the world at the moment is surveillance-based advertising. Surveillance-based advertising is not the only problem, but it is where the money is coming from to drive the information system that we have at the moment. Advertising is what makes money for collecting huge amounts of data about us and using that to influence how we think. It may then be used by states or bad actors or, whoever, but it's advertising that is creating the business model. There are debates in the marketing and advertising space about whether surveillance-based advertising or surveillance-based digital marketing actually works from a marketer's perspective. It certainly makes money, and it's certainly useful from a sort of security perspective, or again, from a spreading of disinformation perspective. It's debatable whether it actually does what it says on the tin for marketers. But what it certainly does is drive this really quite toxic system for information spread that we are experiencing in many different ways in our societies. And so if you take out that financial driver for the way that our information is spreading, you're going to see a different direction of innovation. You're going to see a different direction for online information, for the way that we receive and share information online. I can't necessarily tell you what direction that's going to be, but what I think is important is that when that shifts start happening, that we do think about what are the unintended consequences, what do we want and what do we need out of this new innovative space. So that's why I think surveillance advertising is a problem. It's not about what's being sold necessarily, although in some cases that might be problematic. It's about the system that it drives, the system that it creates and props up. And what we're seeing, which, 5 years ago, it was absolutely ridiculous to suggest that surveillance advertising would be gone. When I first started looking at it, and I was thinking, but this is the problem. This is what's propping the whole problem up. And that actually we need to take the legs out from under it. And then we can actually start thinking and looking at how we move forward. But I didn't really think that that would be on the cards by now. I saw this week in Norway a government-funded proposal looking at banning targeted advertising in Norway and what that would actually look like, how that could change the system. We saw it in President Biden's State of the Union address earlier this year that he was talking about stopping targeted advertising to children. Well, you can't stop targeted advertising to children without stopping targeted advertising, full stop, really. And from a philosophical perspective, if it's terrible for children, why do you want to be feeding it to their parents? Why do any of us want it if it's so terrible? Because it's not just about, children being vulnerable. We're all vulnerable to surveillance advertising and to what it's doing to our information environment. We saw it as well with the EU, with the Digital Services Act, that they started right at the last minute to talk about at least limiting targeted advertising in some ways. I mean, in the end, I think the final draft hasn't made that huge leap that will shift the dial, but it's certainly moving in that direction. And so the fact that legislators in developed countries are very seriously talking about just banning targeted advertising, I think shows that that is the direction that we're going in and that we're looking at a sea change in business models coming down the track in the next 5 or 10 years.
A few months ago, Facebook brought out an ad and I shared it with you. It was a jingle about a minute long. It was a catchy song about why personalised advertising is great.
world where personalized ads help good ideas get found.
And I thought they must really be worried if they're actually trying to convince us that this is a good thing. You saw it. What was your view?
Absolutely. Well, it had lots of bright colours. It didn't quite convince me. And I have to say, I hadn't seen that kind of advertising in my own Facebook feed. So maybe they read my book and thought I wasn't worth targeting with that.
Now, your thesis at the end of the book is essentially that if we lose our freedoms, or if technology takes this away from us, we're going to lose the capacity for innovation and creativity and technology. Is there a threat effectively that tech innovation will eat itself?
I really think there is. And again, one of the things that inspires me or gives me hope is that I'm starting to see technologists and people who've been involved in, tech innovation over the last 30 years recognizing this themselves. And so I don't know if you saw Tim Cook's Stanford address on the freedom to be human and how Silicon Valley itself would not have existed if we'd had the kind of distractions and annoyances, if you like, that we live with on a daily basis today through the technology that we're carrying around in our pockets, that essentially nobody would have been able to concentrate for long enough to create Silicon Valley. And I think seeing somebody like Tim Cook recognizing that is a really strong signal that people are starting to wake up to that issue. And we see as well, organizations like Social Capital as well, moving away and recognizing that actually, investing in things that are going to distract us and just deliver more home delivery food is not going to create the human future that we want, and that we need to be looking at investing in long-term strategies. We need to be taking a pause for thought. And we see a lot of reporting on leaders in big tech keeping the technology away from their own children and themselves in order to have space to think and develop and potentially be the leaders of the future. So that for me does give me hope for the future, that if the people who are creating technology start to recognize that this is a threat to them and to their futures, then they will start to think, well, what are the alternatives? And again, I really hope that as these things start to shift, there's scope for bringing in human rights, fundamental freedoms, the ideas that are not new, but that seem to have been shelved by people who've never really thought of them and never heard about them and are suddenly struggling to talk about AI ethics as something new, whereas actually AI ethics is founded on the kind of philosophical principles on which human rights law is based. And that maybe we can start to have a more holistic conversation that isn't just about privacy through the narrow prism of data protection, but is much more broad about how technology interacts with the rights and freedoms that we need to thrive as humans.
You talked in the book about a woman who was denied a loan based on assumptions that were made about her. Maybe you can just expand that and talk to us about how data can be used in the wrong way.
Algorithmic risk assessments are one of the sort of big areas where your data may well be used in ways that you hadn't thought about. So an algorithmic risk assessment is where, your loan application, your credit application, your insurance application gets fed through an algorithm that looks at you through the prism of potentially endless amounts of data about you that's been aggregated, whether from your use of the weather app, your contacts on Facebook. It could be absolutely anything. Information that you would have no real idea what it is or where it's coming from or how it might be used to categorize you. And so your application where you filled out, your name, your date of birth, job, all of that information goes into this algorithmic risk assessment where the algorithm decides whether or not you are the kind of person that deserves cheap credit, whether or not you're the kind of person who deserves cheap car insurance, or whether you are inherently a risky person. I used to work as an ombudsman at the Financial Ombudsman Service. And towards the end of my time there, this kind of question of algorithmic risk assessment started to come across my desk. And it was really in very sort of mundane ways. So yeah, as you mentioned, a case where somebody had suddenly found that her credit limit had dropped without any warning. And it was, in a sense, the fact that it had gone without any warning that rang alarm bells. And when she complained about it and looked into it, and when I looked into it as an ombudsman, there was no explanation. It was just, well, no, the algorithm has changed its mind about her creditworthiness. And so from my perspective, thinking about that, it's like, well, how could it be fair and reasonable for a decision to be made about your risk if nobody can say why that decision has been made and what it is about you that makes you risky? And so this sort of big data pool is essentially being used to label us as the kind of people you can trust, the kind of people you can't trust, based on a sort of information and analysis of information that nobody actually understands. But because it's all so clever, it must be right. We can't question it. But as I say, certainly from a perspective of an ombudsman, it's like, well, that's not fair and reasonable. It can't be fair and reasonable. But these are the kind of techniques that are increasingly being used in finance sector, in the health sector, in the education sector, about all the places where we might be judged and assessed. This kind of information and these kind of algorithmic risk assessments are being used. And nobody really knows or can explain to you what it is about you that is the problem. But it's essentially an analysis of who the computer thinks you are. And if you're the wrong kind of person, there's no chance at all. And I think I also wrote about, being someone from the Isle of Man, having worked in Uganda. When I returned from Uganda with my Manx background and my, Isle of Man bank accounts and tried to open a bank account in the UK, the computer absolutely said no, despite the fact that I had been security cleared and financial security cleared as an ombudsman. And I could hear the woman on the end of the phone when she said, "Oh, I'll look into it." She came back, I could hear her almost hiding under the table because she couldn't face telling me that the computer had said no, that I was just too much of a risky person to be given a current account in the UK. And what we're seeing now is that is, way beyond where you live, where you're from, sort of basic data points that anyone could actually point to or explain. And it is just this morass of information about where you've been, who you've been with, how you express yourself online. And we saw in the UK, a car insurance company tried about 5 years ago. They announced that they had a great new app that they were going to put onto Facebook, which would analyze young drivers, first-time drivers, Facebook interactions to decide what their insurance premium should be. And obviously it was billed as a way of cutting your insurance premium, which, as a first-time driver, you like to have fairly high premiums. But obviously, what goes up can go down. And so it may be that the analysis of your Facebook interactions was that you were a fantastically safe person who could be trusted with a set of car keys. But it could go the other way and find you being completely excluded from the car insurance market and your dreams of driving around in your fancy new car being absolutely dashed. Interestingly, with that proposal, what they were looking at was not, looking at photographs or announcements that you were about to drive to a party and drink a bottle of vodka. It was much more about how you expressed yourself and how trustworthy that made you, whether you used lots of exclamation marks, whether you made clear arrangements with people, whether you were generally upbeat and overconfident or cautious. It was all in the syntax, not in the actual expressions or things that you were posting or saying. So there was no real way for you to know what it was about your activity that was affecting your premiums. But that proposal in the end was canned by Facebook, who decided it didn't fit with their ethical guidelines, which really says it all. But it is, I think, a really good demonstration of how thinking about the use of data has been progressing in the past and how we might really want to put the brakes on and start thinking in a different direction.
You talked about AI ethics. That's a whole other podcast, but I want to move into the area of facial recognition. I know that you're someone who believes that that's probably a very bad and dangerous thing. What's your thinking behind that?
Well, it's one of those things that, historically I worked a lot on human rights and counterterrorism, human rights and security. And so despite knowing the theory behind privacy and data protection and the use of biometric data in those spaces, I was still someone who, because I was traveling a lot, gave up my iris scan to UK immigration control so that I could get through Heathrow faster, 15 years ago or whenever it was that they were using that. So I didn't really feel it. I didn't really realize what the fundamental problem is, which is not just about whether or not facial recognition works in terms of identifying the right people or the wrong people, what it might mean for social control in that way. But increasingly, what we're seeing is that facial recognition and other uses of biometric data are being used to make inferences about what's going on inside our heads. So not just who we are on paper, what your name is, whether or not you're wanted for a crime in a particular country, but actually being used to look at your photograph and use that information to decide what your sexual orientation is or what your political opinion is, just from a photograph that you might have posted on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on a dating site. That photograph of you is being used to feed machine learning to try to get inside and understand and make judgments about what's going on inside people's heads. Again, whether or not this research is junk, whether or not it actually works, it is being developed and it could potentially be used in ways that will affect all of us. Emotional recognition technology is also being used in a sort of, in a live way to analyze whether or not the algorithm thinks you're lying at an immigration control interview, or to look at the way you're walking, the way you're behaving around a shopping center to decide whether or not you might be thinking about shoplifting. We are seeing very much uses of biometric technology, facial recognition technology, to go beyond a strict identification process and way into the realms of attempting to read and predict what's going on inside people's heads, what they might be thinking about doing, and to use that as a way to stop us. And you can see that really very much, again, going into the science fiction world of pre-crime and Philip K. Dick. Again, if you go back and look at those works, you can really see a template for what we're seeing now and understand why it's a bad thing that we may well want to be putting the brakes on.
So your book is in 3 acts: analog, digital, and the possible. Which one was the hardest to write?
Probably the possible. Creating actionable things so that people feel like they can make a difference was a very hard thing to deal with. And I suppose having spent the last 25 years of my life working as a human rights advocate, I'm very used to getting involved, trying to shift the dial on policy, believing that a different future is possible. But I recognize that not everyone is an armchair human rights lawyer and that not everyone has the bandwidth or the interest to be doing those things. So sort of identifying some of the small things that you can do so that you don't feel completely overwhelmed. And I suppose the other bit that was quite challenging was the analog. Not because of the ideas, I suppose. When I started to look back at the ways that our freedom of thought had been affected in the past, there were so many different ways that it wasn't hard to identify examples. But then the crossover between the analog and the digital made me feel that as I was doing my online research on witch hunts and Nazi propaganda and CIA mind control, I was expecting a knock at the door when somebody started to worry about, where my mind was going, researching all of those things. That was constantly in the back of my mind, which I think really flags the problem with the digital, was that I was suddenly thinking, God, what's someone going to think about what I'm looking at all day, every day here in my bedroom in lockdown?
Neuropolitics is a new term I learned thanks to you. First of all, what is it and why should we be concerned about it?
Well, neuropolitics is a sort of broad term for using neuroscience to understand and engage with political processes. It's something, I suppose, the idea that we can understand how people are thinking and use that to curate political campaigns or affect the way people are thinking. Very broadly, going back to the Cambridge Analytica question, that's partly about, using behavioral science to understand individuals in the political process and use that to affect the political process. There's been academic research looking at brain scans of people to identify how they might be thinking, how they might be voting, how they might be responding to political candidates or parties. One of those pieces of research, which was called Red Brain, Blue Brain, showed that by looking at brain scans of individuals and the way that they responded to a risk exercise, so an exercise really around gambling, if you like, and risk-taking, the way that the brains responded to that exercise, which was a completely apolitical piece of scientific research, when you then looked at those results and read them across to voting registers and the way that people voted in the US, whether they were Republican or Democrat, you could see that the brain scans about responses to risk in an apolitical environment were an incredibly strong predictor of whether or not somebody would vote Democrat or Republican. So if you think about that very broadly, that means a brain scan in a completely apolitical context could well then tell you who you want to get out to vote and who you don't want to get out to vote. Not based on, the banners they've put up in their windows, but based on medical information or based on a brain scan from some other kind of research. Research that was done in the UK in Kingston University prior to the Brexit referendum also really interestingly showed that by looking at brain responses to a series of questions, they could identify voter intention before the voter really knew themselves necessarily which way they were going to go, or certainly before they were consciously admitting to knowing which way they were going to vote. So they were sort of going back behind not just which direction your political tendencies are, but looking at brain scans as a way of predicting which way you're going to go, even when you yourself think or certainly say you're undecided in a vote. So again, going back to that kind of question of what democracy means, if we can use neuroscience to predict the way people are going to vote and then manipulate who goes out to vote, whether or not they can be bothered, and whether that is through distracting them with cat videos or reminding them that voting is a very anxiety-inducing process, so maybe just don't bother today. That still has the same effect on the vote and on the way our democracy and our societies evolve. And we've seen also neuropolitics being used to help politicians hone their campaigns. We saw in Mexico, research was being done and a political campaign was being run using interactive billboards. So you walk past a billboard, you stare at the billboard, you're reading the billboard and the billboard is reading you and feeding that information back to the campaign as to how this is landing with the public. So it's like a sort of, a two-way mirror. You're looking there and they're looking into your mind and understanding how you behave. And so neuropolitics, this idea that we should and could be using neuroscience to swing our elections, to decide on our futures, for me is a really disturbing area that urgently needs regulation. We have this ridiculous situation in the UK where on the television, we have very carefully controlled time and content of party political broadcasts that nobody even watches. While when you go online, you're going to find you're being targeted on YouTube with party political broadcasts based on your data. It's a complete anathema that we're allowed to do anything with our data online and influence and affect us in any way that parties want to, while we have these very strict rules around media, which were designed to protect our elections. So we do need, I think, very urgently around the world, much clearer election legislation and regulation around elections to say, actually, this is not okay and can never be used.
So the moral of the story is don't consent to brain scans.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in September 2021, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, described the way data is collected, used and shared against the background of rapid growth in AI as, quote, one of the most urgent human rights questions we face, unquote. So where do human rights fit with our day-to-day use of technology?
We're very used to listening to discussions around data protection and privacy in the tech space, sometimes as well around freedom of expression. But the fundamental ideas and the sort of unified concepts of human rights are very rarely actually discussed. We hear things like AI ethics, we hear about social justice, but we don't really understand what human rights are and how they apply. So human rights law, particularly as it was developed, starting with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in the mid-20th century, was set up as a framework of really basic rights and freedoms that we need, that we all need, no matter what culture we're from, no matter where we are in the world, that we all need in order to develop and thrive as human beings. It includes things like the right to liberty, the right to freedom of association, the right to a fair trial, the right to freedom from discrimination. There's a really broad range of human rights that we all have, even though sometimes we might take them for granted and not think about them very much until we need them. And when I started to look at this Cambridge Analytica perspective and then the broader issues around data collection and AI, What really came home to me was how data and AI are affecting our right to freedom of thought and our right to freedom of opinion. And what we see about the right to freedom of thought is that insofar as it's talking about what's going on inside our heads, not what we're sharing, but just what is going on inside our heads, that private space inside our heads. It's what's called an absolute right, which means that you can never justify interfering with it. You can limit what somebody says to protect the rights of others or to protect national security or public health and morals. You can limit privacy for similar reasons. But that private internal space, the forum internum, you can never limit. Absolute rights are quite rare in international human rights law because human rights law is pragmatic, it's very practical. Other examples are the prohibition on torture and inhuman degrading treatment and punishment, and the prohibition on slavery. And if you think about those three things, they're so kind of core to our humanity, to what it means to be a human. You can see how vital they are. And so for me, this perspective on data and AI analytics being one of the most fundamental threats to our human rights that we're seeing really comes from this idea that it's getting to the core of what it is to be human, that it is threatening that space inside our heads where we can develop, innovate, also make ourselves safe, decide what it's safe to say to whom and where. Because increasingly, it's not what we say or what we do. It's the inferences being drawn from our data that dictate how we'll be treated, whether we'll be allowed to cross a border, whether we'll be offered a job, whether we'll get that loan, how we will be able to thrive and how we'll be treated in our societies. And that is a really fundamental threat, not only to our freedom of thought, but also has a ripple effect for all of our rights, for our rights to freedom of movement, for our rights to liberty. If you land up in a situation where you're being arrested or detained based on inferences about what's going on inside your head, and for our right to freedom of association, to connect with each other. So from my perspective, when we start to look at technology and our future of technology, future uses of data and AI, we really need to look at the full breadth of what human rights mean. And one of the things that's become almost a truism at the UN level on looking at human rights and technology is that, human rights are the same online as they are offline. And that boundary between online and offline human rights is not as clear as we might often like to think. If you land up in a situation with a social media pylon, for example, that can quite quickly turn into real life threat or, real life danger and harm. And so these lines between this sort of virtual world and our real world are in some senses imaginary and certainly increasingly blurred. And so it's putting human rights really at the heart of what it means to be living in a digital world, if you like, both online and offline, which is vital now.
So before we finish, we've covered many of the bad uses of data. I'm an optimist, so there must be a flip side. Are there companies getting things right that are harnessing technology to help increase our freedom of thought?
There is an increasing move for companies that are trying to give us our space back. So, one of the companies and the tools that I use is the Freedom app, which allows you to override the inevitability of checking your phone every 2 minutes, which, despite having written a whole book about it, I still find very challenging myself. So the companies like that, which are allowing us to find space in the technological world that we're always living in. I'm also an optimist. I think you don't go into law and go into human rights law for 25 years because you're a pessimist. Otherwise, you would just take the money and run. So I'm also an optimist, but I'm not a technologist. What I would love to do is to talk to the people who are innovating, to talk to the people who understand and have ideas about what tech can do, and to bring my understanding of what the human rights risks might be and what the human rights opportunities might be to find this answer to, what do we have next? So I think it's about really bringing together different facets of understanding, whereas at the moment, a lot of the discussions are really very small village. When I see something like the documentary The Social Dilemma, it was great for public awareness raising of what the issues are and what tech companies are doing. But I sort of found myself shouting at the screen saying, but what about actually human rights? This is not new. What you're talking about, these kind of ethical challenges are not new. Why are you not talking to the people who've been working on this for the last, 75 years to actually understand why protest actually is important and not necessarily a sign of extremism? Protest is a part of what we need to be human. And so looking at those kind of debates, you're realizing that it's a group of people who are coming from very similar backgrounds, some of whom have had light bulb moments, but there's very little cross-pollination. There's very little coming together from very different perspectives to kind of say, okay, well, how do we think about this for the future? So that's what I would love to see in the next 10 years.
So almost out of time. We're up to my favourite part of the show, the quickfire round, where we learn a bit more about our guests. So I'm going to throw some quick questions at you. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Window or aisle?
Window.
Online or in the room?
In the room.
Your biggest hope for 2022 and beyond?
The end of surveillance advertising.
The app you use most on your phone?
Freedom.
The best advice you've ever received?
Don't look at anything online when you're pregnant.
What are you reading at the moment?
Kintu by Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi.
In a sentence, what's it about?
It is an epic view of a Ugandan family cursed in the 18th century and how that transfers through to the modern day.
Who should I invite next onto the podcast?
Carissa Velith.
And how do you want to be remembered?
As somebody who made things better.
So as this is the Actionable Futurist podcast, what 3 actionable things should our audience do today when it comes to better understanding their human rights around the use of personal data?
I would look at the amount of time you spend on your phone every day. Check how many hours you're losing. Have a look at an online tool that will read your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed for you and tell you what the data is saying about you. And bear in mind that even if it's completely wrong, that may well be how you're being judged in the real world. And think about how you can put your phone down more often.
3 very actionable tips that people can do today. Susie, a great discussion. How can people find out more about your book and your work?
It's available in all good bookshops around the world. I've even seen it popping up in Namibia as well as Sydney and Beirut. You can buy it online and check out my website, which is www.susieallegre.com, which has a lot of resources, other podcasts, radio and articles around these issues and many other human rights related issues.
Susie, a fascinating and very timely topic. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time and for writing the book.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Actionable Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at actionablefuturist.com. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops delivered in person or virtually at actionablefuturist.com. Until next time, this has been the Actionable Futurist Podcast.